Hello, thank you so much for joining us for this year's Authors and Conversation panel featuring the 2021 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in the oh-so-competitive Children's Literature category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota, with the Children's Literature category specifically supported through the generosity of Books for Africa. As we get started, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, Indigenous keepers of the land on which many of us on this panel are recording from today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow Indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of story in this place now called Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition as well as the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state. Now, I'd like to introduce myself as your moderator for this year's installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series. My name is Cori Doerrfeld, author and illustrator of The Rabbit Listened, which won the Minnesota Book Award in Children's Lit back in 2019. And I am so honored to be joined by this year's finalists. We have Justice Alan Page, co-author of Bee Love, Can Be Hard, written with Kamie Page, illustrated by David Geister, and published by the Page Education Foundation. We also have Daniel Bernstrom, author of Big Papa and the Time Machine, illustrated by Shane Evans, and published by HarperCollins Publishers. Caren Stelson, author of A Bowl Full of Peace, A True Story, illustrated by Akira Kusaka, and published by Carolrhoda Books, part of Lerner Publishing Group. And of course, Kao Kalia Yang, author of The Most Beautiful Thing, illustrated by Khoa, and also published by Carolrhoda Books. Well, like I said, congratulations to all of you. Your books are all simply beautiful and so deserving of recognition. We really want to try and make the best of our short time together and share as much as we can about each of your books. So first, yes, we're going to do a round robin question where I'll ask you all the same question, and then you'll each have a chance to answer it, and then we'll follow it with an individual questions that each are more specific to your wonderful finalist book. So I noticed right away when I was reading through all the books that they all happen to touch on the theme or an actual character that is a grandparent, which I thought was kind of just an interesting coincidence. I know my own grandma was and is always very important in my own life. And so it just seemed, I don't know, it made me feel really happy to see grandparents celebrated in all of your stories. So that is where my first question came from. So here it is. Although all of your books differ in their voice, tone, and place, they all call upon similar themes of family history and the threads that bind the two together. So I was hoping that you could each take the time to first tell us a little bit more about what does the figure of a grandparent mean to you personally or thematically, and then how those thoughts were reflected in your books. I mean, obviously you chose to include a grandparent, so talk a little bit about that. And then do you think there is a need for that? Is there a lack of books featuring grandparents, their stories, their experiences? So I would love if you would start, Kalia, and tell us a little bit about The Most Beautiful Thing.
Thank you, Cori. Thank you for facilitating our conversation. You know, my grandmother, so I only had one grandma who I knew. Grandparents were a rare commodity for, I think, not just my family, but across the mall, because somebody had died in the war. Both of my grandpas died when my mom and dad were just little kids. At the age of 16, my mother left her own mother behind, of course, without her knowing what the future would bring. to share a life with my father. And so growing up, I only had the one grandma, my dad's mother. She had lots of grandkids, but we all only had her. And so she was this person who we revered. My grandpa died when my dad was just 2 years old, so she was the matriarch of our family. In our life, she taught not only her daughters how to become women, but her sons how to become men. You know, she was this woman who traveled with 13 suitcases from the house of one child to the next because none of them had a home big enough so grandma could have a room of her own. And so across these different houses, she carried stories. Not only the stories that were inside of her, but the stories that she would pick up from one house to the next. And so when it was our turn, my older sister and I could not wait. You know, grandma came with her stories. The old ones always felt like songs because we could sing along with her. We knew them so well. You know, the new ones, they were always exciting because they gave us windows and doors into the lives of our cousins, the life that we could not share. Our grandma, because she had so many grandkids, you know, we all fought and struggled to do things for her. It wasn't her job to make us laugh. If we made her laugh, it felt like a huge win. And I was lucky. I had 22 years with her, 22 brief, precious years with her. But my journey as a writer began when she died. My grandmother, although she could read the sky and the earth, the rain and the wind, she didn't know how to read or write. She'd never been in a schoolroom, and her biggest fear was that she would be forgotten. And so when grandma died, I became a writer to write her story into being. So she is not only this incredible figure in my life, this woman with a single tooth who smiled across the landscape of America, from Minnesota to Wisconsin and California and back. And I thought she was incredibly brave. I knew the richness of history inside of her. The mystery and the heartache was always that the world couldn't see it, that they saw this old refugee woman walking in her flip-flops across the seasons, but they couldn't see quite how far she had traveled. And so she's very much an inspiration in my life, a reason why I am the way I am and I do the kind of work that I do. Why I'm always looking to read the earth and the sky, not just the things on the pages. And yes, definitely, we need more books of grandparents, you know, totally in America. I think in this country particularly, we have to return in so many ways to the wisdoms of our elders. And so to have a book about a grandma with a single tooth who smiled at the world, who reminded her grandchild, her granddaughter of the beauty of the things that money cannot buy, the things that we're gifted with. We can always, always use more books like that, in my opinion.
Oh my gosh, no, thank you, Kalia. I could not agree more, and I could not stress what a beautiful tribute this is to everything you said and your grandmother. Definitely. And that brings us to our next author, Justice Alan Page, who also chose to feature a grandparent, a grandfather. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about why you chose to give Otis a grandfather, and then kind of that history between him and his friends in your book, Be Love.
Well, Be Love is a story about family, about connections that families have. And it's really a story about real people and real experiences. My daughter Kamie and I, when we write, it's generally about that. And when it comes to, I'm thinking we've done 3 books now, and we've had a grandparent in 2 of the 4 books, and we've had a grandparent in 2 of them. When I had children, and when Diane and I had children, making sure that they were connected to their grandparents was important. I didn't really realize, and they were fortunate, our children had grandparents who lived to be 94 and 100 years old. So they had them for a very long time. what I didn't realize was that, you know, when you become a grandparent yourself, or at least in my case, my world changed. I certainly was looking forward to being a grandparent, but, you know, hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about it. And I can remember walking into the hospital room with my first grandchild when he was born. In fact, his name is Otis. And seeing him for the first time, and it was like the ground shifted underneath me. I couldn't have anticipated that. I wouldn't have thought it would ever have happened. And mind you, this is after 4 children. But there was something different about it. And so for Kamie and I, it's been important to talk about those relationships and include them in our books as the experiences that we've shared. Indeed, the Be Love Can Be Hard comes out of an experience that Kamie and I and her 2 children, Otis and Esther, had at a bee farm. We have this friend, Farmer Jerry, is actually a real person. And we visited his farm where he has, I think, 5 or 6 beehives. And we thought, what a wonderful story to be able to tell. To tell the story not only of the grandparent-grandchild relationship, but of bees and the power that I think grandparents can enable, for lack of a better word, in grandchildren, and the comfort that they can give, and the comfort that grandparents get. Because my experience is, and something we tried to communicate, is that in that relationship, certainly the grandchildren learn and grow, but the grandparent does also. And we thought it was important that we show that relationship. And, you know, it's interesting. The book is about a lot of things, about bees, about honey, about overcoming fears, about friendship, and sharing my friendship with Farmer Jerry with my grandson, so that he gets to experience that. No, this book happened to be about a grandson and a grandfather, but the same thing goes, I think, for grandsons and granddaughters, for grandmothers and grandsons and daughters. I think it all sort of works as a whole.
Yeah, no, thank you. I know my mom shared very similar sentiments when my daughter was born, who was her first granddaughter, and she just, you put it so well. It was just, it sounds incredible. She said it is almost an indescribable feeling. And thank you again, all of you, for honoring that relationship in your books. Because,
you know, it is almost indescribable. And it always fascinated me, those stories you hear about the grandparents who love the grandkids because at the end of the day, they can send them home.
right.
That's not been my experience.
Aww.
I always hate to see them go. My experience has been one of, boy, wouldn't it be nice to be able to share a home with them, to see them on a regular basis. Not that I don't see them or talk to them every day, but to be a part of their lives on an ongoing basis is really important.
Yeah, no, I feel so fortunate. I got to live near my grandma. It is a gift. It, like you said, both ways. maybe we'll talk to Daniel next, because I feel like your stuff maybe ties in a little bit with what Alan had to say. I know you didn't connect with your grandfather until later, but obviously it meant a lot to you, and you chose to feature that in this book. So if you could share with us a little bit about that in Big Papa and the Time Machine.
Yeah, can I just copy and paste what Justice Page
I
said
know,
and
right?
just put that like well, talk about two similar books. And my message, or what I found, was how important grandparents are as navigators. There are so many questions, especially now in the time that we're living in, and grandparents, especially those that have lived through some of the civil rights, some of the civil rights parts, so that they can talk about that and telling children now, well, this is what it was like back then. I remember talking to another grandparent, not my own, just about being part of integration and being one of the first. So we think of integration as as being done. No, it was this long process, and and you think that things changed overnight. They didn't. That's what grandparent, they can provide that perspective, and things might take a while, or they might give you wisdom that you don't want to hear right at the first. I think of my grandmother, who's given me an immense amount of wisdom, and I ignored most of it. I ignored most of it as a young man, and was like, whatever, I'm gonna do whatever I want. And then years later, I'm like, oh, grandma, you were right. I should have done it that way. But it's still important, even when we don't listen to them. It's important that grandparents say those things, because they do eventually worm their way into our subconscious, and we realize, oh yeah, maybe I should have listened. But with that theme of grandparent as navigator, oftentimes, as a parent and as a guide myself, it's so easy just to just say, well, do this, or here's a bit of wisdom, and not take time to listen to the child that's there. So I really wanted my book, Big Papa and the Time Machines, to be this exchange between grandparent and grandchild, very much what Justice Page was talking about, because we need to listen. We need to listen to one another. I like how the boy in Big Papa and the Time Machine, how it's Shane Evans, a lot of like, whatever, I'm not listening. But yet there's still that, he illustrated it so well that he was part of that conversation. And then, back to those stories, like the stories about somebody's life. And we think our stories are boring. We don't think they're exciting at all, because we live those stories, but they're treasures for the child. And my grandfather's stories were immense treasures to me. I am currently a English instructor at a community college with a pension and a union, because of the stories my grandfather told me about how unions can protect people who are vulnerable. So I deliberately chose my career because of the stories that my grandfather told me. But the thing, I think that some, as a male, a very prideful male, which is me, uh, we, I think, struggle to sometimes tell the harder stories, the stories that we're not necessarily proud of. Maybe we like to tell we like to grandize, and we want to tell, some of the cool things that we did. And you find that in Big Pop in the Time Machine. Like, oh, I left home. I worked on top of these tall buildings. I fell in love, and these big stories in somebody's life. But then, you're holding back, and we're all holding back some of these stories that we're not proud of, and we think, well, should I share those with my grandchildren? Maybe not right away. Maybe there's times that we should wait. That piece about in Big Pop in the Time Machine, where the grandfather admits, I want you to go to school, but I'm going to tell you that I didn't go to school. And how many times do we feel like we can't tell somebody something? We can't share a piece of wisdom because we didn't do that, or we broke that rule. And what I'm saying is, no, your mistake is probably more valuable than your grand story. And to allow yourself to break open. And what is it Dostoevsky said, like, love is harsh and terrible, or something like that. Like, love is just scary, because what is my grandchild going to think of me? Are you going to think that less of me, when actually take your heart, break it open, and that's how love gets out, and that's how the child can learn and move forward, and maybe even connect. And I love what Justice Page said with how the love that he needed, or the love he received from his grandchildren. And that's that last page of Big Pop in the Time Machine, where the grandfather admits, I didn't go to school, but you want to know something? I'm just as scared as you are right now. Justice Page said he didn't want his grandkids to leave. And in Big Pop in the Time Machine, the grandfather's biggest fear is, I'm going to miss you. I'm dropping you off at school, and I miss you every day. And I have to be brave to do this. And the little boy hugs him and says, but that's called being brave. So there is, like, when we break ourselves open and we allow love to come out, then that's when love is the greatest.
Thank you. And I agree. And thank you for putting that in a book, because as I said, it means a lot to me to see these kinds of relationships, because I think that hopefully then will transcend your story to the children reading it, to see that vulnerability, and how even grandparents, because I think sometimes when you're very little, your grandparents can seem almost like supernatural, like, nothing can faze them and you could get away with anything, but know that they, their own humanity, their history. And I love that love that breaks open becomes almost the most powerful gift, lesson, however you want to say it. So thank you for writing Big Papa and the Time Machine, and sharing so much of your thoughts about it. And that brings us to Caren's book, which I know is a little different, because we don't literally have the grandma, but I still feel like this bowl, the grandmother's bowl, is such a symbol, and such a powerful symbol within the book that kind of keeps holding the family together, bringing the family together. So if you could talk a little bit about that symbol of the grandmother's bowl, and kind of choosing to have that be a focal point. I know this is based on a real story and then a different YA book that you wrote, but if that stems from actually meeting Sachiko, and was it in the other book, or it's just something you chose for the picture book? I would love to know more about the grandmother's bowl featured in this story. Caren?
Thank you so much. It was just a joy to listen to everyone.
I know.
Wow, I'm still kind of swallowing listening to everyone. Grandmother's Bowl, or A Bowl Full of Peace, is focused on Sachiko's grandmother's bowl. And Sachiko's grandmother is kind of a hidden figure in this story. She never appears. She passed away before the story even begins. But we know this bowl was handed down. We don't know how many years or how many generations, but that bowl was given to Sachiko's mother, from Sachiko's grandmother, as a wedding present. And it's a treasure of a bowl. And to me, and I know to Sachiko, all the fingerprints of her family and her grandmother and on down are on that bowl. And to me, those fingerprints represent all the stories that were told through that bowl. That bowl just, to me, when I look at it, is just filled with the stories of not only Sachiko's story, but the story of war and horrible war and the promise of peace. And as everyone is talking about their grandparents, I think I can almost weave my own story, everybody else's story, because my grandmother, the grandmother that I grew to know, my Nana, was an immigrant. She came to the United States when she was about 6 years old from Russia. And when I was about 25, sort of flashback came back to me as I was listening. I asked her, we were both living in Boston at the time, and I asked her if she would just tell me her stories. And we sat on her balcony, and I had a tape recorder going, and it was a tape recorder back then. And I just asked her to start at the beginning. And the beginning for her is in Russia, in a shtetl. And she could remember, even at 85, what the smell of the soil felt like, the cow that would stick its head through the window. They were living in the cellar of this very small room in a hut practically. I mean, she recalled the pogroms and the Cossacks coming through and the burning and the deciding to come to America. And as, you know, that is a 6-year-old little girl, and Sachiko is a 6-year-old little girl when we begin this story. And so my grandmother's story is tied up with war as well. And she came to the United States, and I think about how she came really traveling across, you know, practically walking with her family across Europe to get to Amsterdam, to get to Boston. But then she lived to see, you know, a man on the moon. I mean, I just think that the arc of what our grandparents saw is just amazing. I also asked her about how she adopted my father, how she actually lived through World War II with 3 sons in the war. So as I came to Sachiko's story, my mind, my heart had been very well steeped in World War II, which is why her story just resonated with me. I think about her life and my life, and her stories are part of me. Her stories are part of my DNA. And then her stories and my stories are going to need to combine when I share my stories with 2 little grandchildren that I have now. So I mean, Justice Page, when you were talking about your grandchildren, I was like, yes, yes, yes. Because it's an amazing feeling to be a grandparent. When my grandson was born, he's turning 4, I decided to take my grandmother name as Nana, and thinking about my own grandmother. And I just felt so good about being able to pass on or embody that name, so I could pass on all those stories that I want to tell him. And I'm, you know, I think my greatest, you know, pain living through this pandemic is that we have a little granddaughter that was born in November, and I have yet to meet her. And I'm hoping soon, but there is just something so that I will never get back to hold that little infant and to smell her hair or smell her little head and hold her in my arms as a little, newborn. I'll never get that experience because of this pandemic. And I know that many grandparents were separated by war, by immigration, that they never met their grandchildren. And I can understand that heartfelt pain, not being able to do that. I know this importance of connection and being disconnected. And I think we have all spoken to the value of somehow keeping that connection alive, whether it is holding each other if we can, or through our stories if it's not possible to hold each other tight. But I think having sat down that summer with that cassette tape recorder and listening to my grandmother, I think this was my first introduction actually to oral history and some practice as I began listening very closely to people who have stories to tell and teach us. And our grandparents all had those stories. But I continue to learn from people who have important stories to tell. And that's why I spent so much time with Sachiko, listening so deeply to hers.
We're going to delve a little bit more specifically into each of your books. And I was going to start with you, Justice Page, in your book, Be Love. And I know you spoke a little bit before how it's about many, many things, about beeves. We have Otis and his grandpa. But the concept that I really, really enjoyed was how when you have a fear, sometimes if you confront that fear and you learn about it, it can really help you cope and then eventually, deal with that fear. And as an author, I know I struggle sometimes with fear over writing, how you put together a story. And I wondered if you had any specific fears getting into becoming an author that you would share with us. And then if there were any kind of special challenges or things when writing Be Love in particular that you and Kamie encountered.
In terms of fear of writing, where do I begin? As a child, I had a real fear of writing. I struggled with writing, not because I couldn't do it, but because I was afraid that people wouldn't like what I wrote, that they would make fun of it, that they would have, I wasn't so much concerned about their opinions, but there was something about exposing yourself on the written page that it took me a long time to overcome. I had the same thing in terms of speaking publicly. Eventually, I overcame the fear of speaking publicly. One way you do that is by doing it and finding out that the world doesn't collapse when you do, even if you happen to make a mistake. The world continues to go on. But with the writing, it was a real challenge for me to get comfortable with it. I really didn't become comfortable writing until during law school, when we had in order to graduate, you had to do this, what we called a long paper. It was really a long legal brief. And I sat down to do it and I couldn't do it. And I was in to see one of the assistant deans one day, and he said, and I said, I don't think I can do this. And so I may not make it. And he said, well, we let you in here, you can do it. What you really have to do is apply yourself. And I'm thinking, I've been spending hours upon hours upon hours on this, and I can't get word one down on the page. And I said, but I have been applying myself. He said, no, what you need to do is apply the seat of your pants to the chair until you get it written. And for some reason, that was enough of a catalyst to break the logjam. And I sat down and I wrote the paper, and it was fine. Fast forward, what do I end up doing as a career? Appellate court judges do two things. They read and they write. And interestingly, one of my interests in joining the court was I thought I could be a good writer in explaining court cases, having struggled through far too many court cases that seem to have been written in ways that were designed to make it more difficult to understand than to help the reader understand what was going on. And by then I had fallen in love with the written word. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, my wife Diane was coming up on the 25th anniversary of the Page Education Foundation. And she said, you know, this foundation is about education. You spend a lot of time in schools and classrooms. You should write a children's book. And I'm thinking, I've never written a children's book. It's one thing to write a brief. I've got that down pretty well. I can do that. But I don't have clue one about how you go about writing children's books. Well, because Kamie had been working with me doing some speech writing, I enlisted her help. She's a second grade teacher, and so has as much time as I spend in schools and classrooms. She's there every day, and so she has a connection with kids that I thought would be helpful. We talked about book ideas, went through 5 or 6 ideas, finally settled on one. But we had the idea, but we still didn't know anything about the book structure, how they come together. You know, having read a lot of them, I certainly knew that. I mean, speaking of grandparents, one of the things I loved when the grandchildren were younger was reading with them, having them sit in your lap, 2 or 3 of them at a time, sometimes 4, and reading children's books, whether they're picture books or story books, whatever. That's like heaven. But writing one, and not having thought about writing one, I was, even though we had a story and what we thought would be interesting, you know, how does this all come together? And I was really fortunate. One day, someone managed to arrange for Nancy Carlson to sit down with me and just give me a sense of, you know, the structure of a book. How many folds, how many pages, how many, you know, how much should go on one page? How does the layout work? And suddenly it was almost like a light bulb went off. Kamie and I had the idea, and it came together almost like magic. Indeed, when Diane suggested we write the book, it was about a year before the 25th anniversary celebration, and we wanted to have it for that celebration. By the time we sat down with Nancy Carlson, I think we had 5.5 months to the date. And as you know, these books take a while to get produced. I mean, it takes a while just to, refine the words once you get them on the page. Well, 5.5 months later, the book had been printed. And it was really a wonderful experience.
I can't agree more too with that advice, because I know I still use it too. Not that I got it directly from that source, but the best way to solve that writer's block is just to sit down. Sometimes just sit down and write, just get started. Because sometimes I know I get so worried or afraid in my own head. If you just sit down, I like that. Just apply yourself to the seat, get started. So thank you again, Justice Page, for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Kalia, I would love to speak more about The Most Beautiful Thing. So this book kind of takes us all over the place through the grandmother's stories, but then the granddaughter's experiences. We kind of go through, history and the present, the jungles of Laos, and here we are in the US and living room, and kind of just time and place are very flowy, and it really made me wonder where your own sense of time and place comes from, and if you would share with us a little bit kind of that personal view and where it stems from, and then how it influences your writing in books such as The Most Beautiful Thing.
I love that question, Cori. Thank you so much. But before I answer it, Justice Page, I should tell you that I'm a Page scholar. I am a Page scholar, and so I don't know if there are any memories, but 20 years ago, I was a freshman at Carleton College, and for my project, I wrote my very first children's book. It was illustrated by my brother, and we submitted it to Mona as my project because we've been looking all summer for a book about a Hmong boy, and there were none to be found. And so I didn't think I was going to be a writer then. I was in school to become what I thought a doctor should be, because that was so necessary in my family and my community. But my very first children's book was written for the Page Education Foundation. So it's really an honor for me to be a part of this conversation with all of you, but particularly to be a part of the legacy of the Page Foundation.
Well, you can't imagine how heartwarming and wonderful that makes me feel, and how it would have made Diane feel. What you just said is what the Page Foundation is all about.
And I thank you. And I thank Diane too. Wherever she is in space and time, I thank her. And I'm so proud to be a part of the story that you both have written together, and you continue to write with your work in the foundation. And
well, we are honored by you.
Thank you. So space and time, there's so many ways to answer this question. And I think the most honest way is in terms of a story. It was foggy, and when I saw space and time approaching me, it was from the fog of nowhere. I was a child and I was afraid. It was a stranger. And then when it got closer, it was a stranger with beautiful pockets everywhere. And out of those pockets came things that I didn't even know how to expect. Butterflies, flowers, but more important than anything, experience and stories. And so that stranger became my friend, and I dabbled with space and time. I danced with it. Of course, the sun got higher and higher in the sky, and I got older and older. And somewhere along the way, I realized that it was all going to be fleeting, that it was all just a gift for a moment in time. That by evening, perhaps space and time would develop wings, and that it would fly away far from me. And so it became really, really precious. And I think that moment came when my grandmother died. It was one of those moments when I knew that this gift was only for the moment, and that the moment had to be cherished and it had to be held. And then, of course, when I became a mother myself, holding my daughter's feet for the very first time in my hands. I have tiny hands, but her feet were even smaller. And I felt the pulsing of her heart, and it was like the body of a bird. And again, I knew that time was a thing with wings, and it would fly away from me. With every kid, I have 3, this thing, it becomes more poignant. And at some point you realize that your time is leaving, and I wanted to leave something behind. And all of my books for adults and children are all of these love letters that I want to leave behind. Because this experience, for everything that it has been a gift. To be loved by all of these people and to love in return to the very best of my ability every single day. And so I imagine 1 year, many, many years from now, when I'm like that creature in the fog of everything, some descendant somewhere will come across one of my books and they'll open it, and maybe they will find the words of love that I had for them, even before I knew of their possibility. I'm Hmong, so we come from this history of ancestral worship. Every year around New Year's, my father, we make a meal and he calls all of my ancestors to the table. And we burn incense sticks and the whole house becomes foggy. And when I was a child, I could see them there as real as you and me. But with every year, they became dimmer and dimmer. And that table became bigger and bigger, stretching far beyond the walls of our home. And I always think about my place at that table. I imagine sitting there somewhere and knowing that I was a part of all of the stories happening around me, but also being some kind of bridge to the past. And so in all of my work, I'm continually reaching from the past to the future. Everything happens in tandem. Everything is always together. My grandmother is no more, but through me, my children can meet her. One day I will be no more, but through my books, I can reach that future. And so it is this continuous conversation in my head. And I think because of the freedom, because of this friendship that I have with both space and time, I'm able to sing and dance with the wind and the rain in a way that I never could have if things were just one way, or if I saw the past as simply the past. My father has never met his father. I said earlier that my grandfathers died when my parents were just children. But my father has this foggy memory of a man sitting by a fire, saying to my dad, don't cry, little boy. And those are the words that he's held on for all of these long years. He says to my siblings and me, I am nothing more and nothing less than the father I imagined for myself. I think about that imagined father. I think about that imaginary grandfather. And although I can't meet him in Cori, in how many unwritten books have I spoken to him? Have I sat beside him in that fire? Smoke sometimes is so real that my eyes sting and tears fall. That is the gift of what we get to do when we enter the page. Time and space are walls that can collapse, and all of the past and the future can be as one, moving in tandem in the confusion and the chaos. That is the gift of being here and now. And so for me, it's always those walls going down so my hands can reach far higher than they do. So I can dance in the spaces where there is no music.
I think it's truly incredible that both you, Kalia, and Justice Page said that you did not intend to be writers, yet you literally just exude stories. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. It's just try to wrap my mind around that, how you just never really meant, right? Didn't you both say they never really meant to find this path, yet it seems like exactly where you were meant to wind up. So Big Papa and the Time Machine, like Kalia's book, also kind of takes us through different times and spaces. We literally kind of go back in time into the grandpa's past through his words, through this car that you can tell means so much to him. And I know in your author's note in this book, you talked about how you met your grandfather later in life and how much it meant to connect with him and how much the way he actually spoke and told his stories meant to you. And I wondered when you actually sat down to write this, if you had any actual notes or recordings, or did you actually just have to sift through your own memories and this kind of, if you would share with us a little bit your writing process and really trying to capture truly the way he told the story through your own words.
Well, it was exactly what Kalia said with, I love the imagery that she used to borrow from Madeleine L'Engle, right? The Wrinkle in Time. It does bend, and stories, they are the time machine that can take you anywhere, anywhere. And that's what it felt like meeting my grandfather. Yeah, I'm adopted, so I was a college baby, and parents couldn't raise me, and so I I sat in a hospital in Iowa for a few days, 4 days, and my mother, the woman that would become my mother, had heard about me sitting in the hospital, and my dad was a doctor, and he was the doctor that delivered me at that time, and I told her, well, there's this baby sitting in the hospital, and there was no one to take me, and so he said, well, if he's going to go into the foster care, well, I guess we'll take him. Like, thanks, Dad. That's a great way to, but I guess we'll take him. And sure enough, there's no one for many reasons to take me. And so my dad said, well, you're coming home with me. That was a fantastic gift, changed my life forever. But I lost and I grieved the loss of Black culture, because I was in white Iowa, and very few people looked like me. Uh, no clothes fit. I didn't. I mean, and then because it was so white, that the stories, it was very Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and pretty much nothing else. And so I didn't grow up with knowing very much. So then when I was 18, I met my grandparents first, and then I met my biological father. And in meeting my grandparents first, it was like finally like everything started to make sense, and I got connected to this history that I never had. I mean, I speak differently, um, but if you put my father and I next to each other, we act very much. It's weird. We act very similar. It's like a clone. It's awkward and strange and wonderful. But so it was my grandfather, though, who shared with me most of my history and the backstory. And so he would go driving around Chicago and point out the different buildings that he built, talk to me about unions, talk to me about moving to Chicago, talk to me about prejudice, and the different colored drinking fountain, the different drinking fountains for different people, and how he was denied work or used, uh, and wasn't compensated because of the color of his skin. But he never was judgmental. He was like, I would get angry, but he was very loving. He was a very loving man. And I learned something in that, in those exchanges where it's like, I want to be like that. I want to be loving. And he was firm. He stood up for himself. When he eventually became part of the union, the story goes, he went into the supervisor's office and said, there's me and all these other African Americans here. We all leave unless you treat us right. So he wasn't he wasn't a pushover, but he was a very loving man. And I did record him. I did record him speaking. I took notes, so that way I wanted to remember. I wanted to remember these stories. I liked Kalia, how she said that some of the stories were like songs, and you could sing them again with them, because then you wanted to hear those stories. And so he had told me some of these stories over and over, and I wanted to hear them again. So when my nana passed, and I would call my grandfather every week, and then I realized that he was fading, and so I wanted to make sure that I didn't lose these stories, because it literally, the mind is so fickle, and I knew I would lose them. So I recorded some of his speaking. I wrote down the notes, and I wanted to get him just the way that he said. So in the book, it changed from the original to more of this dialogue, this back and forth. So they're very much his, like, his words. I mean, there's a lot more of the things he said, but very much of the things, putting those stories and me having this fictional conversation back and forth with him. And I wanted to keep it in Black English. And sometimes, like, there's a pushback in the publishing world, because there's this desire for standard American English. I was speaking with a Chinese instructor so he taught English in China, and he was Chinese. And he told me about some of the reasons why Americans and the Chinese have issues. He says, Americans are so precise. This word means this, and everything is laid out, and it's like they're trying to get you. Where Eastern languages, or especially Chinese, is beautiful and flowery and colorful, and you think of the images, and there's a lot of emotion in the language. I think we've seen a great demonstration of that here, where Eastern language and the beauty of that language. When we just play to standard American English, we lose emotion. We lose the beauty of other cultures when we shove it into a single form. And I didn't want to do that. The African American experience is not a standard American. It's informed by, but it's not the standard American experience. And you think of the songs African Americans would sing, and the stories that they would weave into those songs, or the quilts that they would do, or the oral storytelling. This is not a single culture, an American culture. This is an African American culture, and I didn't want to lose that, because that was part of who Papa was, and that was part of my history. So when I wrote it in Black English, I wanted to preserve the beauty of the language, and I wanted to preserve the cultural beauty, form, and history that was tied to it. And I forget the professor who eventually who went through and basically standardized, or picked up the very similar forms of speaking, and there's actually a book called Black English that I referenced to make sure that I was getting it right.
I'm learning so much about you all, and you're all so honest. I really appreciate how honest you've all been about your own pasts and experiences, and struggles, and everything that goes into becoming an author. And Caren, I didn't mean to leave you last again, but I know you have a lot to say, because there's obviously a lot of history embedded in this book. A Bowl Full of Peace, we follow Sachiko, true story, her family's experience during the bombing of Nagasaki, World War II. And I know I spoke to you, and you actually first wrote a young adult version of this book called Sachiko, a Nagasaki bomb survivor's story. And you have met with her, you have spoken with her, and obviously are very passionate about this subject. And I was hoping you could share with us a little bit about your experience in meeting Sachiko, writing the longer story, and then how you wound up turning it into a picture book, and maybe anything that you faced that was challenging, because we all know, as Justice Page, all of you have touched on, I mean, picture books are their own kind of beast, because you have to get the words just right. We have a limited amount of space, a limited amount of pages. So yeah, anything you're willing to share with us about, your meeting Sachiko, writing the longer book, and then bringing us to this picture book. We would love to hear it, Caren.
Thank you, thank you. There's something about being last that you can just absorb all these stories and all your words. I just want to begin by saying I am so honored to be with all of you, with all of us here, all 5 of us, 6 of us. But I want to thank you for your stories. They are beautiful, and they are so needed. So I know how much time, how much effort, how much struggle goes into writing picture books. So thank you so much. And Cori, thank you for your question. You are right. I have been on a journey. I am still on Sachiko's journey. It's been a long one. Sachiko has been in my heart and mind since I first heard her story. It is a story about her survival. She was only 6 years old on August 9th, 1945. At the end of World War II, she was playing house, making mud dumplings. She was a half a mile from ground zero when the atomic bomb exploded over her city of Nagasaki. Very few people survive. It is truly a miracle that she did survive that bombing. And so writing her story and having her friendship and beginning to understand her arc and her pathway to peace has literally changed my life. I'm often asked how I met Sachiko, and I met her in Minneapolis. It was 2005, so we're talking 16 years ago. But she was invited to the Twin Cities by the St. Paul Nagasaki Sister City Committee to help commemorate the 60th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the end of World War II, and to tell her story. And I happened to be at the Peace Park where she was speaking and listening to her story. And I just thought her story, we needed to hear it in America. We all needed to hear this story here. And our children needed to hear this story. Gandhi says, if we want to have peace, we must start with the children. And I believe that, but we all have to start with it also. I want to say that I would not have been able to meet Sachiko without the St. Paul Nagasaki Sister City Committee. St. Paul and Nagasaki are sister cities. They are the oldest sister city relationship between an Asian city and a US city. So my work with Sachiko and A Bowl Full of Peace is really an example of our friendship together. When I first started working with Sachiko, and I was trying to remember as I was sitting at my desk her story, this story started out as a picture book. And as I started writing it, I realized that I really didn't have enough information. I didn't remember enough to write a true story. And I knew at that point, if I was going to do this, I was going to need to reach out to Sachiko she was back in Nagasaki at that point. And I decided I would write her a letter. And I reiterating in my mind, in my heart, my own thoughts that we needed her story in the United States to understand what happened to her and the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the absolute horror of nuclear war. She wrote back and she agreed to work with me under one condition, that she would tell me her story as long as she could look into my eyes. Sachiko is a very wise woman. She realized we needed a relationship, that we needed to look into each other's eyes to know that we understood, and she could see that I could at least try to understand her story. And I also realized I was going to have to go to Nagasaki to do this work. I have to say that our work was really all through translation. Sachiko does not speak English. I do not speak Japanese. So we needed a translator, we needed an interpreter when we worked together, but we both knew we were really working from the heart. We really were beginning to understand what our mission was. So it took me 6 years and 5 trips to Nagasaki to write that first book that I thought was a picture book, but ended up as a YA nonfiction of her story and the folding in of the history of that time. And after that book was published, Sachiko was published, my dear editor, Carol Hinz at Carolrhoda Lerner Publishing Group, suggested I write a picture book about Sachiko. And I had to smile because here I was, full circle, writing a picture book. But this time, I was not challenged by how much, not knowing enough. I knew so much about Sachiko, and the challenge was how was I going to condense this story into, as we know, that structure of a picture book. I had to think about what shape it was going to take. I knew in the first book, in my research, I knew that Grandmother's Bowl played a huge role in that story. This bowl was the only object Sachiko's family found in the rubble of their home. Everything else had been destroyed. And when her father went and was digging in the rubble, he found Grandmother's bowl, and he pulled up this bowl, and this bowl had not a crack, not a chip in it after that explosion. So as they were looking at this bowl, we know all the fingerprints of everybody in that family was on that bowl. Everybody who survived and all who had perished. Sachiko lost 23 members of her family in that blast. 3 of them were her brothers. I knew as a picture book writer, I was going to follow that bowl. In that story, that bowl becomes a very precious treasure for Sachiko's family, and it becomes a treasure for the book. It becomes a bowl of memories and hope and peace. Every August 9th, her family would gather together, and her mother would put ice chips in that bowl. And all day long, Sachiko's family would think about and remember all who were lost and how thirsty they had been. And that ice would have just cooled their throats because it was so hot with all the fire and the blast. Everyone was dying of thirst. And they would pray to all people that they lost, and they would pray for peace. When I asked Sachiko if that we would like to write a picture book, her answer was yes. And she gave me grandmother's bowl. And here it is.
Oh my goodness.
Bowl. I know. This is the bowl that her father pulled out of the rubble. And this is the bowl that survived by a miracle. And Sachiko's survival was a miracle also. When I think of this bowl, and I think of writing this picture book, I knew I was going to follow the heartbeat, the emotion of the story. I was going to listen for the sounds and the rhythm and the repetition. And I was going to leave all the historical facts that I had put in the big book. I would leave that for the YA book. I wanted children reading this to know how much you lose in a war. You can lose everything. And everything that you can lose is what is most precious to us.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It has been an honor to speak with the children's literature category finalists tonight. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed listening to us, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel for the Minnesota Book Awards steward organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. And of course, we got to mark our calendars, Thursday, April 29th. That is the evening that the Minnesota Book Award winners will be announced for this category and the 8 others. So hope you can attend. The event will be online, but it's free. It's free to attend. You just have to register in advance. You can visit thefriends.org/MNBA to reserve your spot. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Cannot thank you guys enough. Thank you to everyone listening. I hope everyone out there takes the time to check out all of these remarkable books. And always, always, always keep seeking out new stories. Listen to other people, especially those that are different than you. So thank you. Thank you.